January 15, 1945. The Texas Panhandle. In a land known for scorching summers and mild winters, something unprecedented was happening. A polar front had descended from Canada, bringing with it temperatures that hadn't been seen in the region for over 50 years. Ice glazed the prairie grass, and wind howled across the flat landscape with nothing to slow its fury. In cities across Texas, residents huddled around fireplaces and stoves, unprepared for weather that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. But nowhere was the cold more desperately felt than at Camp Hartley, a small prisoner of war facility 30 miles outside of Amarillo. Here, in a compound designed for the temperate climate Texas was known for, 43 German women prisoners faced a winter that neither they nor their American captors had anticipated. Before we discover how these women survived the impossible, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 3 weeks earlier, when the first real cold snap hit the region. Ursula Zimmerman stood at the window of the women's barracks, her breath creating small clouds of frost on the glass. She had been captured 6 months prior in France, serving as an administrative clerk for a Wehrmacht supply unit. Now, at 24 years old, she found herself in a land she had only read about in books, facing conditions that made her question everything she thought she knew about America. The barracks had been constructed quickly in 1943, designed to house male prisoners who would work in the surrounding agricultural fields. When the decision was made to transfer a group of German women prisoners to the facility, minimal modifications had been made. The building had thin walls, a single potbelly stove at each end, and windows that rattled in their frames whenever the wind picked up. During the mild autumn months, it had been adequate. Now, as January brought unprecedented cold, it was becoming clear that adequate was nowhere near enough. Ursula wrapped her thin wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. The blanket, standard issue for all prisoners, had seemed sufficient when she first arrived. Now it felt like little more than paper against the penetrating cold. Around her, the other women were beginning to stir from their bunks, their movements slow and reluctant. No one wanted to leave the small warmth their bodies had created beneath their blankets during the night. Clara Hoffman, the youngest of their group at 21, was coughing again. The sound was wet and rattling, a sound that had been growing worse over the past 3 days. Ursula glanced toward her bunk with concern. Clara had been a nurse's aide before her capture, skilled at caring for others but seemingly unable to care for herself. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, and her blonde hair lay damp against her forehead despite the freezing temperature in the barracks. The morning roll call was brutal. Captain James Thornton stood in the compound yard, his breath visible in thick plumes as he watched the 43 German women file out of their barracks. He had commanded prisoner of war facilities for 2 years, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the ethical complexity of watching women suffer from conditions beyond anyone's control. The women stood in formation, their bodies rigid with military discipline despite the cold that made their lips turn blue and their hands shake uncontrollably. They wore the same gray auxiliary uniforms they had arrived in, supplemented now with whatever additional layers they had managed to acquire or improvise. Some had wrapped their feet in strips of torn blanket, others wore multiple pairs of the thin socks issued by the camp. None of it was enough. Maria Klein, the natural leader among the prisoners, stood at the front of the formation. At 28, she had been a radio operator before her capture, accustomed to giving and receiving orders with precision. Now she maintained her composure even as frost formed on her eyebrows and the wind cut through her uniform like knives. Captain Thornton had come to respect her quiet dignity, the way she never complained even when circumstances demanded complaint. Lieutenant Rebecca Morrison stood beside the captain, her own regulation coat inadequate against the cold. She had fought hard to be assigned to oversee female prisoners, believing that women in captivity deserved female supervision. Now she watched her charges suffer and felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. These women were her enemy by definition of war. Yet they were also human beings enduring conditions that violated every principle of the Geneva Convention regarding prisoner welfare. The count was completed quickly. Everyone wanted to return indoors, guards and prisoners alike. But as the women began to file back toward the barracks, Clara Hoffman stumbled. She caught herself, before falling completely, but the moment revealed what she had been hiding. Her fever had worsened overnight, and her strength was failing. Johanna Bauer, the oldest of the group at 32, immediately moved to support her. Johanna had been a cook in Stuttgart before the war, a woman who had joined the Auxiliary Corps, believing she would simply be feeding soldiers, not becoming entangled in the machinery of war itself. Now her maternal instincts took over as she wrapped an arm around Clara's waist and helped her toward the barracks. Dr. Eleanor Walsh, watching from near the medical building, made a note on her clipboard. She had been monitoring the women's health with growing concern. The cold was taking its toll, and her medical supplies were limited. She had treated frostbite on 3 women already, and Clara's respiratory infection was becoming dangerous. Samuel Bridger arrived at Camp Hartley on a morning when the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees below zero. He drove an old Ford pickup truck that looked as weathered as its owner, pulling up to the main gate with a patience that suggested a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. The guard on duty, Corporal Billy Hayes, checked his paperwork with cold, stiffened fingers. Samuel had been hired as a civilian maintenance worker, someone to handle repairs and general labor that the military personnel were too stretched to manage themselves. At 58 years old, he seemed an unlikely candidate for manual labor, but his references from the Corps of Engineers were impeccable. What the paperwork didn't convey was the depth of experience written into every line of Samuel's weathered face. He had spent 30 years in the Colorado Rockies, working as a wilderness guide, trapper, and eventually as a survival instructor for military units training in mountain warfare. He had lived through winters that would have killed most men, learning from Native American elders and from his own hard-won experience how to survive when nature showed no mercy. His hands were scarred from frostbite and axe work, his eyes perpetually squinted from decades of reading landscapes and weather patterns. He wore a heavy wool coat that had seen 20 winters, boots lined with fur he had tanned himself, and a hat made from rabbit pelts that kept his ears warm in any temperature. Captain Thornton met with Samuel in his office, grateful for any help he could get. The camp was struggling. The heating systems designed for mild Texas winters were failing under the unprecedented cold. Supply lines were delayed by ice storms across the region. The captain explained the situation with the kind of blunt honesty that soldiers use when circumstances are dire. Samuel listened without interruption, his pale blue eyes studying the captain's face with an intensity that made Thornton slightly uncomfortable. When the captain finished, Samuel spoke for the first time. His voice was rough from years of disuse, the voice of a man more accustomed to speaking with mountains than with people. "You've got women prisoners freezing in barracks that weren't built for this weather," he said. It wasn't a question. The captain nodded, relieved that Samuel understood the gravity immediately. The older man stood and walked to the window, looking out across the compound. In the distance, smoke rose weakly from the barracks chimneys, the wood supply clearly inadequate for the demand. Samuel watched the smoke with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the language of fire. After a long moment, he turned back to Captain Thornton. "I can't fix your heating systems," he said, "but I can teach those women how to not freeze to death. There's a difference between having fire and knowing fire. They need to know fire." The first meeting between Samuel Bridger and the German women prisoners happened on a gray afternoon when the wind had finally died down enough to allow outdoor activity. Lieutenant Morrison had been skeptical of the captain's plan to allow a civilian to interact directly with enemy prisoners, but desperation had overridden protocol. She assembled the women in the yard, explaining in careful English that they would be receiving instruction in fire management and cold weather survival. The women stood in uncertain silence, unsure what to expect from this arrangement. Samuel emerged from the maintenance building carrying an armload of various materials. Wood scraps of different sizes, dried grass he had collected from somewhere, strips of bark, and what appeared to be a collection of stones. He set everything down in the center of the yard and gestured for the women to come closer. They approached cautiously, their distrust evident in their movements. To them, he was another American, another representative of the country that held them captive. Samuel seemed unbothered by their wariness. He had dealt with suspicious animals in the wilderness for decades. Frightened women were not so different. He began without preamble, kneeling in the snow and clearing a small area down to bare ground. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he selected several flat stones and arranged them in a circle. When he spoke, his words were simple and direct, stripped of unnecessary elaboration. "Fire is life," he said. "Everything else is just details." The women watched as he began to build what looked like a tiny structure, using the smallest pieces of wood. He arranged them in a specific pattern, creating spaces for air to flow while maintaining stability. Ursula found herself leaning forward, fascinated despite herself. She had built fires before, everyone had, but she had never seen anyone approach it with such deliberate precision. Samuel noticed her interest and met her eyes briefly. "You speak English," he said. It wasn't a question. Ursula nodded, her throat suddenly dry. She had been studying English since she was a child, one of the reasons she had been valuable as an administrative clerk. Samuel gestured for her to kneel beside him. "Tell the others what I'm doing," he said. So Ursula became the translator, describing in German as Samuel explained the principles of fire structure. He talked about the importance of airflow, about how wet wood could still burn if you understood the progression from tinder to kindling to fuel wood. He demonstrated how to identify dry material even in snow, how to use your body heat to dry damp kindling, how to build a fire that would burn hot and long with minimal smoke. The other women gathered closer, their initial suspicion giving way to curiosity. Even Maria, who had maintained her distance out of principle, found herself watching intently. Samuel's hands never stopped moving as he talked, building and rebuilding the fire structure to demonstrate different techniques. Over the following week, Samuel's lessons became a daily ritual. Each afternoon, regardless of the weather, he would appear in the compound yard with new materials and new knowledge to share. The women began to anticipate these sessions, preparing questions in the mornings that Ursula would translate during the lessons. What had started as simple fire-building instruction was evolving into something more comprehensive. Samuel taught them how to read the wind, how to position their bodies to conserve heat, how to layer clothing in ways that trapped warmth more efficiently. He showed them which foods provided more sustained energy in cold weather and how to recognize the early signs of frostbite before permanent damage occurred. Clara, despite her lingering illness, proved to have an unexpected aptitude for the practical aspects of fire management. Her hands, trained in the precise work of medical assistants, adapted quickly to the delicate arrangement of tinder and kindling. Samuel noticed her skill and began giving her more complex tasks, teaching her how to start fires with increasingly limited materials. The challenge seemed to energize her, giving her a purpose beyond simply enduring each frozen day. Johanna approached fire building with the same methodical patience she had once brought to cooking. She asked Samuel about heat distribution, about how to maintain consistent temperatures for extended periods. He recognized in her questions the mind of someone who understood that survival was about sustainability, not just immediate solutions. Maria remained somewhat distant, but Samuel could see her watching everything with keen attention. She was learning even in her silence, storing away every technique and principle. He suspected she was the kind of leader who needed to master something herself before she would fully commit to teaching it to others. Her pride wouldn't allow anything less than competence. The transformation in the barracks was subtle but significant. The women began reorganizing their living space based on Samuel's teachings about heat retention and airflow. They repositioned their bunks away from the walls where cold seeped through most aggressively. They created a rotation system for tending the stoves that kept fires burning more consistently through the night. They learned to dry their clothing and blankets in specific ways that prevented moisture accumulation while maximizing warmth. Lieutenant Morrison watched these changes with a mixture of relief and something deeper that she couldn't quite name. These women were her responsibility, her charge to keep alive and as comfortable as circumstances allowed. But beyond duty, she found herself genuinely moved by their resilience and their eagerness to learn. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were adapting, growing, becoming more capable with each passing day. One evening, as Samuel prepared to leave for the day, Ursula approached him with careful steps. She carried something wrapped in cloth, handling it with obvious care. She unwrapped it to reveal a small notebook, its pages covered in neat German handwriting. "I have been writing down everything you teach us," she said quietly. "So we remember. So we can teach others if needed." Samuel looked at the notebook for a long moment. February 3, 1945. The weather reports had been warning of a major storm system moving south from Canada for 2 days, but no one at Camp Hartley truly understood what was coming. Meteorologists called it a once-in-a-century event, a convergence of Arctic air and moisture that would bring temperatures below zero and snowfall measured in feet rather than inches. By mid-morning, the first flakes began to fall. Within 2 hours, visibility had dropped to less than 50 yards. By afternoon, the storm had transformed into a howling white nightmare that erased all distinction between earth and sky. Captain Thornton ordered all prisoners confined to barracks and all non-essential personnel to shelter in place. The camp's heating system, already struggling under normal winter conditions, began to fail as power lines succumbed to ice accumulation. First, the women's barracks lost electricity. Then, section by section, the entire compound went dark. Emergency generators kicked in for essential buildings, but the prisoner barracks were not classified as essential. The women found themselves in near darkness with only their potbelly stoves for heat and light. Samuel had been in the maintenance building when the power failed. He immediately gathered every piece of dry wood he could find, every tool that might be needed, every supply that could help people survive extended cold. He loaded his truck with materials and began making his way across the compound toward the women's barracks. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet multiple times, and the snow was already deep enough to make walking treacherous. Lieutenant Morrison met him at the barracks door, her face tight with worry. The wood supply was lower than anyone had realized. With the storm predicted to last at least 2 days, possibly 3, they would run out before morning. Samuel surveyed the situation with the calm assessment of someone who had survived worse. The women watched him enter, their faces illuminated by the weak firelight from the stoves. He could see the fear beginning to creep into their expressions, the understanding that this was no longer just uncomfortable but genuinely dangerous. He set down his load and began issuing instructions through Ursula. They needed to consolidate heat. Instead of trying to warm the entire barracks, they would create a survival zone around one stove, using every blanket and piece of fabric to build insulated walls. The women moved quickly, following his directions without question. Maria organized teams, her leadership skills finally given full expression. Johanna gathered all available fabric. Clara, still weak but determined, helped arrange blankets into makeshift walls. Samuel taught them a technique he had learned during a winter, trapped in a mountain cabin. They would burn their fire hot and fast for short periods, heating stones around and beneath the stove. Then they would bank the fire low to conserve wood, while the heated stones radiated warmth. It was a rhythm that required constant attention, but would make their limited fuel last far longer than conventional burning. Outside, the storm continued to build in intensity, the wind screaming around the corners of the barracks with a sound like dying animals. The first night of the storm tested everything Samuel had taught them. The women worked in shifts, maintaining the fire's rhythm exactly as he had demonstrated. 2 women stayed awake at all times, one tending the stove, while the other monitored the stones and checked on those sleeping. The others huddled together in the insulated zone they had created, sharing body heat in a way that transcended the barriers of nationality and circumstance. Samuel remained with them through the night, moving between the barracks and the maintenance building where he had established a secondary supply cache. Each trip through the storm was a battle against wind that tried to knock him down and snow that blinded him completely. But he made the journey repeatedly, bringing additional materials, checking on conditions, ensuring that the women had everything they needed to survive. Around midnight, a crisis emerged in the guards' quarters. The main building's heating system had failed completely, and the soldiers found themselves without heat in quarters that had never been designed for survival without mechanical systems. Sergeant Martinez made his way through the storm to the women's barracks, desperately seeking Samuel's help. The older man listened to the situation and made a decision that would later be discussed in official reports for months. He brought the guards into the women's barracks. The regulations were clear about separation between guards and prisoners, but survival took precedence over protocol. Lieutenant Morrison, present in the barracks throughout the ordeal, made the call to allow it. 8 American soldiers entered the prisoners' shelter, and the German women made room for them without hesitation. Samuel organized the expanded group efficiently. The guards brought additional supplies from their quarters, including emergency rations and medical supplies that Dr. Walsh had sent along. In return, they followed the fire management system that the women had already mastered. Corporal Billy Hayes found himself working alongside Clara, the young woman he had watched from a distance for weeks. She showed him how to arrange the stones for maximum heat retention, her hands moving with practiced confidence despite her lingering weakness. He followed her instructions carefully, struck by the absurdity and rightness of learning survival skills from someone who was technically his enemy and his responsibility to guard. The storm reached its peak intensity around 3 in the past morning. The barracks shuddered under the assault of wind that must have exceeded 60 miles per hour. Snow found its way through gaps in the walls that no one had known existed, creating small drifts in the corners of the building, but the fire held. The system Samuel had taught them continued working, the heated stones radiating warmth even when the fire burned low. The insulated zone remained survivable, if not comfortable. As dawn approached, bringing no real light through the white chaos outside, something remarkable was happening inside the barracks. Germans and Americans sat together around the fire, sharing coffee that Johanna had brewed using techniques that stretched their limited supply. They communicated through gestures and broken phrases, through shared exhaustion and shared determination to survive the night. The storm finally began to break on the 3rd morning. The wind diminished from a scream to a moan, and eventually to a whisper. Pale sunlight filtered through, clouds that were slowly dispersing, revealing a landscape transformed into something alien and beautiful. Snow had drifted against the barracks in waves that reached nearly to the roof in some places. The entire compound was buried under more than 4 feet of accumulation, with drifts that towered twice that height. Captain Thornton emerged from his quarters into a world remade by ice and wind, immediately beginning the process of accounting for his personnel and assessing damage. What he discovered surprised him more than the storm itself had. When he reached the women's barracks, he found a scene that defied every regulation and expectation. German prisoners and American guards sat together around a fire that still burned steadily, maintained by a rotation system that had kept them all alive through 72 hours of unprecedented cold. They were exhausted, their faces marked by smoke and sleeplessness, but they were alive and largely unharmed. More than that, they were talking to each other with an ease that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Samuel stood near the stove, checking the remaining wood supply with the same methodical care he brought to everything. He looked up as the captain entered, his weathered face showing the strain of 3 days without real sleep. "They did good," he said simply, gesturing toward the women. "Better than most soldiers I've trained. They listened, they learned, and they kept their heads when things got bad." Lieutenant Morrison provided a detailed account of the 3 days. She described how the women had maintained the fire system without fail, how they had shared their space and resources with the guards without hesitation, how Ursula and Maria had organized work rotations that ensured everyone got rest while maintaining continuous fire management. She spoke of Johanna's resourcefulness in stretching food supplies and Clara's quiet competence despite her illness. The captain listened with growing respect, recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in his camp. The women who had been enemy prisoners 3 days ago had become something different through the crucible of shared survival. They had proven themselves capable, resilient, and remarkably generous in circumstances that would have broken many people. He made arrangements for the guards to return to their quarters once heating was restored, but the separation felt strange now, artificial. Over the following days, as the camp dug itself out from the storm and worked to restore normal operations, the effects of those 3 nights continued to ripple outward. The guards who had sheltered in the women's barracks spoke openly about the experience, about the skills the German women had demonstrated and the humanity they had shown. Corporal Hayes requested permission to continue learning fire management techniques from Clara, framing it as practical training that could benefit the entire facility. His request was approved, setting a precedent that other guards followed. Samuel resumed his daily lessons, but now they included American personnel alongside the German prisoners. The distinction between captor and captive had not disappeared, but it had become less rigid, less absolute. The fire had revealed a truth that regulations and prejudice had obscured. When survival was at stake, nationality mattered less than character, and competence knew no borders. The women had saved not only themselves but also their guards, and everyone in the camp understood the significance of that reversal. April brought the Texas spring with sudden warmth that felt miraculous after the brutal winter. Wildflowers appeared across the prairie in explosions of color, and the memory of February's storm began to feel like something from another lifetime. But for the women of Camp Hartley, spring brought something more complicated than simple relief. It brought the announcement of repatriation procedures and the knowledge that their time in Texas was ending. The war in Europe had entered its final phase, with Allied forces pushing deep into Germany from both east and west. Official communications from Washington indicated that female prisoners would be among the first repatriated once Germany surrendered, processed through displaced persons camps before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. Ursula sat in the yard on a warm afternoon, watching Samuel teach a mixed group of prisoners and guards about identifying edible plants. The scene would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Now it felt natural, right, as if this had always been the proper order of things. She thought about Hamburg, the city where she had grown up and lived until joining the Auxiliary Corps. She had received one letter from a distant cousin who had survived the bombing campaigns, describing streets she wouldn't recognize and neighborhoods that no longer existed. Her parents' apartment building was gone, her mother and father's, fate unknown. The Germany she would return to bore no resemblance to the country she had left. Maria approached and sat beside her, understanding without words what Ursula was contemplating. The older woman had been corresponding with the Red Cross for months, trying to locate her family in Berlin. The responses had been discouraging. Her neighborhood had been in the Soviet sector during the final assault on the city. Records were incomplete or non-existent. She might have family waiting for her, or she might have no one. The uncertainty was harder than knowing would have been. "We learned something here," Maria said quietly in German. "Something about who we can become when everything we thought we knew is stripped away." Ursula nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They had learned Firecraft from a mountain man who had every reason to hate them, but had chosen to teach them instead. They had learned that Americans could show mercy without forgetting justice, that former enemies could become something approaching friends when circumstances demanded cooperation. Clara had recovered fully from her winter illness, strengthened by proper medical care from Dr. Walsh and the confidence that came from mastering skills she had never imagined needing. She had been teaching Corporal Hayes German phrases during their fire management sessions, and he had been teaching her about Texas history and culture. Their friendship had grown into something neither of them had intended but both valued deeply. Now they faced the reality that this connection, like all the connections formed during these months, would soon be severed by regulations and geography. Johanna had been the most practical about the approaching repatriation. She had been writing detailed notes about everything Samuel taught them, creating a manual that she planned to take back to Germany. If she was going to return to ruins, she would return with knowledge that could help others survive and rebuild. She saw it as her duty, her way of transforming captivity into something useful. Samuel continued his lessons through April, never acknowledging the approaching end explicitly, but somehow making each session feel more significant than the last. He taught them things beyond Firecraft now, sharing knowledge about resilience and adaptation that went deeper than practical skills. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came over the radio in Captain Thornton's office, and within minutes the news had spread throughout Camp Hartley. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally over in Europe. For the American personnel, it meant relief and celebration, the knowledge that the long nightmare was ending. For the German women prisoners, it meant something far more complex. It meant the certainty of repatriation, the approaching day when they would board trucks and trains that would carry them back to a homeland that existed now only in memory. The processing began immediately. Official paperwork, medical examinations, interviews about their service and capture. Lieutenant Morrison handled much of the documentation personally, writing detailed reports about each woman that she hoped might help them in whatever came next. The final day at Camp Hartley arrived on May 23rd. The women packed their few belongings into the same bags they had arrived with 10 months earlier, but everything had changed since that first day. They were not the same people who had stepped off the transport trucks in uncertainty and fear. Ursula carried her notebook filled with Samuel's teachings, pages dense with diagrams and instructions written in German. She had added her own observations and reflections, transforming it from a simple manual into something more personal, a record of transformation as much as technique. Maria had organized the women for their departure with the same leadership that had helped them survive the winter. But her usual stoicism cracked when saying goodbye to Lieutenant Morrison. "Thank you for seeing us as people," Maria said in careful English. "Even when regulations said you did not have to." Clara stood with Corporal Hayes in the yard, both of them struggling with a farewell neither wanted to make. He had taught her to see America as more than just the enemy nation that held her captive. She had taught him to see Germans as individuals rather than a faceless enemy. He gave her a small photograph of the Texas prairie in spring, wildflowers stretching to the horizon. "Remember that beauty can grow anywhere," he said, "even in the hardest ground." Johanna embraced Dr. Walsh, thanking her in broken English for the medical care that had saved Clara's life and for the dignity with which she had treated all of them. The doctor pressed a medical reference book into Johanna's hands, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Samuel appeared as the women were boarding the trucks. He had stayed in the background during most of the official farewells, uncomfortable with emotional displays. But as Ursula moved toward the vehicle, he called her name. She turned, and he handed her something wrapped in cloth. Inside was a fire steel, the same tool he had used during their very first lesson. "You know how to use it," he said simply. "Teach others." She clutched the gift to her chest, understanding the weight of what he was giving her. "Thank you for teaching us that survival isn't just about staying alive," she said, "it's about staying human."